So, hello everyone. Today we'll be having Abhijit Iyer Mitra. Our topic for today is why India did not have a Renaissance of its own. If we take a look at the period from say 380 to around 680, we find that in India there were a lot of brilliant researchers, philosophers, writers, artists. We have got Aryabhatta who accurately predicted the circumference of the earth. We have got Brahmagupta, whose algebra, who basically is the father of algebra. He started off algebra. He gave Indian numerals the form that they have today. We have got Vatsyayana, whose famous work, the Kama Sutra, is so well known around the world. Then in writers, we have Kalidasa, and finally we have the great philosopher Adi Shankara. So if we had so many great men in this period of 300 to 600 AD, and we had say a process of where people were reinventing themselves, people were exploring science, people were exploring arts, people were exploring philosophy, and then giving their own views and writings. Where did we fail as a nation? Where did we fail as a civilization? And mind you, the contributions made by all these great researchers from India of this period have driven not just India but the whole world forward. The Indian numeric system is now used all over the world. The medicinal research done in this period is now famous all over the world as Ayurveda. So where did we fail as a civilization? What went wrong? What did we do right? And what are the comparative analysis say with the Renaissance in Europe, where the Renaissance then full-fledged blows up into a industrial revolution. So I'll hand over to Chinmay to give an introduction of our speaker, Abhijit Iyer Mitra. Thank you.
Actually, there is no need to give a formal introduction of Abhijit because he's quite renowned amongst the youngsters in our country. He is a senior fellow at Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, that is IPCS. He's defense analyst. He also shared some of the views on economy, history, and strategic studies. Because of his logical approach and sort of views, he's well received by the youngsters among the country. He, constantly writes in the print as well. So, welcome Abhijit, and thank you for joining in today's discussion.
Okay. So, just a quick question to all three of you. When do you put the start date of the Renaissance?
Of the European Renaissance around 1350s, 1350s, 1400, as in the time period where it started. I mean, it was not in its boom, but it had just started.
Okay. So 1350. Chinmay, what's your earliest date for the Renaissance?
Regarding the Western or the Indian Renaissance?
You're echoing too much.
No. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
So is it the Western or the Indian civilization?
There is no Indian Renaissance. I'm only talking about the Western Renaissance. There is no Indian Renaissance.
Somewhere around 14th century onwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mihir?
I think 1350 or so.
So what if I told you you're all wrong and it starts off in the 1000s and 1100s in Europe?
Okay.
Now I'll tell you why. First, remember what we saw in Europe was a series of invasions and population migrations happening in the 400s, starting by about the 200s, but gaining ground in 400s, 500s, the Dark Ages set in, and that continues till around 1000. Now, in the 1100s, you start seeing a very significant reversal of patterns. There is a significant public wealth being created. There is significant urbanization happening starting from the late 1000s to the early 1100s, to such a point that by around 1100, guess what the per capita income of India is, the UK and Italy is. India is around 450 in modern day dollars, around 450. Britain at this point is around $650. Italy is the richest of the lot at $850, almost double of what we have in India.
Because of Venice. Right.
Variety of reasons. There is an end to a whole load of fiscal irregularity. There is an end to a whole load of climate phenomena. There is an end to invasions. So, for example, there is internal war, yes, but the population migrations into Europe have stopped by around 500-600. Right. So for 400 years, you have not had any major disruptive invasion happening and things like that. Now, what is the first sign of urbanization? Is literacy. Now, in literacy, we need to separate the different kinds of literacy. There is practical literacy, there is numerical literacy, and there is clerical literacy. What you had in the dark ages from the 500s onwards was clerical literacy restricted to less than 1% of the population. What you start having from the 1000s, basically full time from the 1100s, is practical literacy, numerical literacy. For example, you go even to a illiterate part of India, and you ask them if they have a mobile phone and what they can do with, can they call your mother or something like that, they will still know what numbers to press. Now, that's literacy. So there was a great, because of urbanization, you have a need for record keeping. And what happens with all this record keeping is you have a need for literacy, practical literacy, which is what takes off. Now, practical literacy tends to be vernacular. It doesn't tend to be Latin. You're not going to keep your go and learn Latin and learn all the theological things just so that you can keep accounts and things like that. And this booms at this point. You see a whole increase, and it is reflected on the ground where public goods, public proclamations you have stored, public goods in terms of guild houses, in terms of formalizations of processes and procedures. They're happening throughout Europe in this place, right? They're still not, remember our modern concept of nationality that somebody speaks, Europe is now a linguistic concept. Germans speak German, French speak French, Italians speak Italian. This wasn't there at that point. It was kind of united under Christendom. And it was everybody spoke Latin in the upper classes. In the lower classes, the vernacular mattered, but they didn't determine what a sense of nation was. So you have this entire process happening. The next thing you have is archiving. Okay, very, very important, because in spite of all the wars and everything, in India, you ask them for records of Harsha's kingdom, or records of the Kushan kingdom, or of the Satavahana kings, or the Chalukya kings. Where are the records? They'll say, oh, because the destruction was brutal. Well, Europe also had extremely brutal destruction. We can't even think of wars the way Europe fought those wars. And in spite of that, we don't have record keeping. So there was a whole system of record keeping in Europe. Higher per capita income, archiving, record keeping, everything at this point of time is extremely high. So when Gutenberg starts the printing press, people think of Gutenberg as the sort of putting the match to the powder keg in starting the thing. No. Gutenberg was the symptom. He was the effect. He was not the cause. Okay. So you're looking at this. In fact, documentation in Europe, if you compare it to India at this point, is something like almost 100, 200 is to 1. You can't even make a ratio because you don't have day-to-day documentation in India. In Europe, you do. And that is a sign of public wealth because it's a storage of public records of ordinary people and things like that. Now, given that the average European is already worth a lot more, almost 2:1 at this point, average Western European, what happens then in the 1300s is the Black Death. Okay, now the Black Death wiping off almost a third of your population. As it is, labor is extremely valuable. Humans are extremely, a normal Western European at this time is already worth twice the value of an average Indian. What the Black Death does is it places such a high premium on labor that you're looking at per capita income going through the roof. And this is kind of the trickle-down effect. Before, you can at least argue that income disparity was very great. At this point of time, the reduction in labor and the ability to negotiate for better wages goes through the roof. In fact, you look at the German wars of religion that happened after Martin Luther and things like that. A lot of it has to do with negotiating wages and for German lords to beat back almost 200 years of consistent wage and price increases that had happened over this period of time. That's in the 1500s. So this is all the symptoms. The causes are starting again with the Black Death. Then, of course, in the 1190s, what you had in 1190, Byzantium, Constantinople is sacked. The transfer of wealth. Now, remember, Constantinople was a city that hadn't been sacked for almost 650, 700 years at this point. The kind of capital accumulation that happened in one city, you can see the immediate effects in Europe. So starting 1190, the kind of wealth transformation, as it is, they're very rich, well, compared to India at least. The kind of wealth transformation you see happening in Europe at this point is absolutely phenomenal, right? And all of this starts adding up because your population is now 2/3 of what it was by the end of the 1300s. The next process that happens because of the plague is your loss of faith in religion. We've been good Christians, and so there is that questioning. So even the word Renaissance itself is wrong because what they're looking at, why is there a need to look back to Rome or Greek philosophers? It's because of a loss of faith. And mind you, they're not looking back at Rome and Greek philosophers because this knowledge was already existent. In fact, the Arabs had preserved this knowledge much better than the West. So what happened was with the Crusades, you also had a significant knowledge transfusion of old European knowledge back into Europe. So it was already there by the 1100s and 1200s. Right. So when you say the Renaissance, the knowledge of these old European texts had become far, far more widespread even before the Renaissance had started. What happens now is, in order to sustain blasphemy, effectively what the Catholic Church considers blasphemy, what you end up having is you have to prove continuity. In order to prove legitimacy, you have to prove continuity. So, it's, for example, how you would have a supposedly low caste king like the Mauryas, who would then claim that they were the descendants of Surya Vamsham or Rajavamsham and put on some fake claim that they are actually descended from Rama's fourth wife's 10th sons, 15th cousins, daughters, 56th cousins, aunts, uncle's daughter. This is the same kind of process you see because legitimacy, like government policy today, even if you take a full U-turn, for there to be public trust, you have to create legitimacy. Legitimacy comes through drawing links to the past. So the Renaissance was a facade. The knowledge already existed, but for new art forms, for new knowledge, for new innovation to flourish, you had to somehow create that link to the back. So for example, today, if we say, beef eating should be okay, you will justify it using the Vedas. See, they ate it in the Vedas, therefore I'm eating. If you want to ban beef, you will also say, see, but the Dharma Shastras say beef is bad. So Renaissance wasn't a Renaissance at all, even in the Western sense, because it's an artificial timeline. The process had already started. The Black Death, the human value addition, simply exacerbated it. And this was a need to create an artificial link to the past, where you said, look, the early church accepted these philosophers. They accepted the Neoplatonic school and things like that. And therefore, we are drawing our legitimacy directly. We are not going through secondary sources. We're going back to the original, to primary sources. Whereas if you look at all the knowledge being produced, the knowledge, the art, the literature being produced, it's completely new at this point. Alighieri, Dante effectively starts off vernacular Italian. Right. The Normans in Sicily actually are the precursors to Alighieri Dante. So you look at the Norman conquest of Italy around the 1000s, Roger II of Normandy. He is the one that kicks off modern Italian literature. Dante, again, people will tell you Dante started off the Italian Renaissance. No, he did not. Dante was the symptom. Roger had already started it off in Sicily based on the fact, he considered Christianity, he was almost certainly an atheist because he considered Christianity to be quite crude. And when he captures the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, Al-Kamil, he doesn't capture it. Al-Kamil, the Egyptian Sultan at this point, just gives it to him. And the chief mullah, not mullah, the muezzin, no, the Qazi of Jerusalem had told his guys no prayers this evening from the Al-Aqsa Mosque because we don't want to anger the Norman Franks, the Normans. And he turns around and he says, why did you do that? I came here to listen to the prayer being read out. And I apologize for the fact that my men look like pigs and stink like pigs. So this was the kind of thing that was happening in Europe. There was a significant movement away from religion that had already started by the 1100s. It became much, much more pronounced. The next was financial systems and things like that in Europe. Now, if you read Barbara Tuchman's A Calamitous 14th Century, I highly recommend you all read that. What you realize is, unlike in India and Persia at this point of time, where kings could raise taxes as they wished, in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Italy, you simply couldn't do that. You had to call a meeting of the three estates, the nobility, the clerics, and the farmers, the freeholders as they were called, not the tenants, the freeholders. And the freeholders had to approve the tax rise. Imagine, even when the French king is captured and taken to Britain as a hostage, the king can't shove a tax rise through unless the people he is going to tax agree to the tax rise in the first place. In India, you do not have any of these systems. So you're looking at great structural stability, financial system stability at this point of time. Whereas even a few hundred years before, the Templars, for example, when the head of the Templars was tortured and killed ultimately, the poor guy didn't even know. He was the head of the biggest banking enterprise in the world at that point of time. He didn't even know what he was signing because he was illiterate. And yet within 200 years, all of this has changed from the 1100s and things like that. So the start is the 1100s, right? Now you come to India. What is happening in India out here? By the 500s, you're looking at significant endogamy setting in. So caste becomes very, very pronounced. In the Gupta period, you're not looking at such pronounced caste, but by the end, by the Harsh period, Harshavardhana and the Chalukyas and things, you're looking at a very harsh caste system that is set in by the 700s, but we can tell from genetic records that the endogamy had started around the 500s. Why this is happening, we don't know, but it correlates with significant deurbanization. Now remember, urbanization happening in Europe around the thousands, but from 500 AD continues to about 1500 AD in India, 1000-year period, you're looking at deurbanization. Deurbanization means the need for practical literacy reduces. Right? You don't need literacy. There is no need for record keeping, or it's a vastly reduced need for record keeping. You also see this in a lot of other things. You have a lack of public goods. Where are the guild halls? Where are the councils? Where are the formalized laws or even the traditional laws with regards to finance and things like that? You don't see them. Where are the guild meeting held? You don't see them. You look at public architecture in Europe at this point, not churches, just public architecture for the common well-being. It is enormous by the 1100s. In India, it's virtually non-existent from 500 AD, well, even before that. Public goods, the concept of public goods doesn't seem to exist in South Asia after Harappa. But the only thing that is spent on is temples. Now, what does this tell you? Now, when you contradict a traditionalist in India, they'll tell you, but you know, temples were universities, they were everything. Why is it in Europe at this point that you have specific things being built for specific purposes? In India, you don't. After Nalanda and Vikramashila and all of that, where are the specific buildings? So you see this happening. There you have a great specialization of labor happening, a specialization happening. Here you have a de-specialization happening. So there's a whole set of sociological trends you can see happening out here. There is a lack of formal consultation. The kings can impose taxes as and when they want. And then, of course, you have the Turkic invasions out here. And the Turkic invasions are devastating because remember, before you had nomadic invasions, the Kushans came and set up their empire in India. They were Central Asian. But they ruled for about 150, 200 years. It was a very placid rule. They were sedate. They created greater common goods and wealth. What happens with the Turkic empires, you see they last between 40 and 90 years. Not a single one of them, I think, lasted more than 90 years. And even there, the rate of replacement of kings, of sultans is so rapid. There is no creation of public wealth happening because it's all extractive. So in addition to de-urbanization, you also have these extractive processes. The next thing is you don't have archiving. Like I said, even if somebody wanted to look back to the past, where would an ordinary man sitting somewhere in Bihar go? He doesn't know where to go to gain a Hindu knowledge to look back at his past and things like that, right? The next thing that happened was in Europe, you saw practical knowledge being vernacular knowledge. In India, you see the reverse process happen. That on one hand, Hindus are focusing entirely on clerical knowledge, which is to say in Sanskrit, which is inaccessible to the common man. And the invaders are doing it exclusively in Farsi, which wasn't even their native language. It was a prestige language. They used to mostly speak Turkoman or Chagatai, Turkic and things like that amongst themselves. Farsi, even for them, was a foreign language. They did not speak it in day-to-day affairs. So you have this creation of a foreign language syndrome and an inaccessibility, the more accessible. So see, there was a demand and supply that led to Gutenberg creating the printing press. That demand and supply, the need, simply didn't exist in India. That was the amazing thing at this point. So what you see here is in Europe, human value keeps getting increased. In India, it keeps getting decreased. Okay, the wealth extraction at this point is so bad. There are many visitors and travelers who come here who comment on it, even as late as the 1600s. When Sir Thomas Roe comes to India, he's appalled. And, the traditional narrative is, oh, we had 33% of world trade. We were the richest country on earth. Blah, 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 blah. Your per capita income by this time was 1/3 of what Britain's per capita income was. Britain didn't get rich because they colonized India. Britain became richer because they colonized India. They were already much richer than you. The average Brit was already way, way, way better off. When Thomas Roe comes to the court of to Shah Jahan or Jahangir, I forget, he's stunned by the inequality in India. He's like, if we had this kind of crap in Britain, our monarchs would be losing their heads left, right, and center. Right? So even those systemic checks and balances did not exist at this point of time. So what I will say to you is that everything is a question of at what point do you ask the question why? Everybody believes that it was Gutenberg that started off with the printing press. Gutenberg catered to demand, which accelerated the process, but it did not start the process. You have to ask the question, why did we not have a printing press? Why did we not have a Gutenberg? And what I've tried to show you in the last 23 minutes, I overshot my time, has been that the necessary ground conditions never existed in India. They did in Europe. And it is a lot of things coming together.
Okay. The first question that we want to ask you in continuation of what you said regarding public infrastructure is that what are the different parameters, as in historically you always find the proof of certain things. Like there are buildings where universities used to be, they may or may not be there now. Or there is proof of some say sewage systems in cities. So what are the different parameters that are used to quantify civilizational progress vis-a-vis India and vis-a-vis Europe?
Yeah, so several things. One is public works. What is your water supply and what is your drainage supply? We still don't know what the water supply into cities was. We still don't know what the drainage system was, because after Harappa, you don't really have very clear examples of drainage. Even in the Maurya period, you don't have these clear examples, right? It is public goods like bridges. It is public goods like universities. We do have examples of universities. So we have Takshashila, we have Vikramashila, we have Nalanda. But you look at their size, they're tiny compared to the things that are happening in Europe at this point of time. And anyway, they're on the decline. Now, outside of universities, public guild halls, town halls. Town halls, why? Why would a country invest in town hall? Because it's clearly formalized a system of consultation. You're not going to the king's court to plead with the king. It is a formalized consultation system with offices built in there where you have to go, where the king also has to come and account for his policies at this point of time. Where are the bridges, right? Where are the dams? When you ask them dams, they'll say Grand Anicut in Tamil Nadu. That is one example. Where are the rest? See, these are the exceptions that prove the rule. So even in Muslim India, where is the public architecture? You know, I live in an area of Delhi that's surrounded by old tombs. But other than tombs, what is there that you can actually say that any of these dynasties of the Delhi Sultanate built for the people? Nothing. There's only Hauz Khas Lake nearby, and other than that, there's nothing. So there is a whole measure of things where you can judge. Institutional stability to guild halls, stock exchanges, financial trades, and things. Public essentials in terms of drainage, sewerage, water supply, wells, etc., etc., bridges. So universities being centers of learning, basic schools being centers of learning. For example, even in churches and abbeys at this time, you had very clearly marked classrooms. You never had that in India. It's just a temple with maybe a courtyard surrounding it. That's it. Jo karna hai kar lo, multi-purpose space, which means you're not specialized. So these are the measures of civilization.
Let's say the Indian progressive period is approximately from 300 to 500 or 600 AD, maybe, in which we find a high density of individual researchers who have accomplished many things of significance in their lives, such as Aryabhatta, so on and so forth. There are a lot many names.
Yeah.
So, of course, these people would have needed some kind of institutional support, some kind of the demand and supply should be matching at this point. So, if we compare India 300 to 600 AD to Europe in the 1200 to 1400 ADs, are there any similarities?
No, I think there are two periods of similarity. One is the Mahajanapada period, where you have a significant creation of public wealth and knowledge, because there's a lot of folk narratives from this point of time, right? You also see that because it's a republic, the kind of wealth generated, the sort of evenness and spread of that wealth was significantly better. You have the Axis age happening at this age. So Buddha is happening around this point of time. The Jains, of course, claim that they're much older than the Vedas. But if you look at Western historiography, Jainism is also happening around this point of time and things like that. Zoroaster is happening around the world. So there's all of that. The second is the Gupta period and slightly before the Gupta period, though you can extend the Mahajanapada even into the early Maurya period. So it is really from the Shungas to the Guptas that there's not much knowledge for that period. So post Maurya to Gupta. But you look at the Mauryas themselves, there is a significant accretion of economic knowledge happening at this point, the Arthashastra primarily, which lays down the basics of any good economy. And surprisingly, it is in the Arthashastra you find that all, which in a way kind of sabotages it. It's too capitalistic and not socialistic enough. Because, Chanakya doesn't believe in public goods. He's like, if you want a drainage system, you build it. The only thing I'm going to tax you for is for the internal security and regulatory mechanisms. That's it. Internal, external security and regulatory mechanisms. Baki ka jo karna hai, tum log karo. you do need a sort of state social structure. It has to be state driven. It has to be king driven, which he kind of removes, which is very good in a modern day and age, in the information age. I'm not too sure it's very good in that period. But then what happens is you have the counter reaction to that almost immediately. Because remember, Ashoka begins the collapse of the empire. He turns it into a full-on socialist. I mean, screw Marx. Ashoka was the father of Marx. Marx should call himself Ashoka Putra Marx, because everything that Marx said later on, Ashoka started. You can see from the falling revenue, from the depreciation of the Mauryan coinage, that there was serious economic crisis during Ashoka's own time. Because everything was my bap, literally my bap ki sarkar. Devanam Piyadasi, I'm the father of my this thing. So it was literally a my bap government when the state was spending on anything and everything, and he destroyed Maurya finances. And in a way, it was that one bad. Think of Ashoka having the effect on public spending that communism had in Europe, where they've turned so vitriolically anti-communist. When the West is embracing socialism, it is places that were formerly ruled by communists like Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, where the pushback against socialism is the hardest.
Right.
And that is what you're seeing. Ashoka led to today's Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. Ashoka led to, so we had our own, the Shungas were our version of Viktor Orban, or Andrzej Duda, the Polish president, of Vladimir Putin. Because they hated, they saw communism, they hated it so much, and there was that pushback. So you didn't have that spending on public goods happening after that anymore. So if the closest period I would say would be the Mahajanapada, maybe through to the Mauryas. I'm still a bit conflicted about it. I'm just giving you a very rough kind of categorization. And then that period from about 300 to 500.
Can we hypothesize that there was that period from 300 to 500 AD, which is so-called better, much better economic prosperity than later or than earlier, we could say that. There was a good volume of trade also happening, and there were a lot of researchers like this Aryabhatta, Brahmagupta. I mean, the whole algebraic system, which was inherited from here by the Arabs, and then it went to the West, the whole decimal algebra system.
So the problem is we don't have enough coinage to actually plot an economic system at this point. It's too erratic. We don't have the systemic coin troves that we find in the West to be able to do that. But generally, the creation of knowledge is a sign of increased peace and increased prosperity. So it's inferred that this particular period was a time of increased peace and prosperity. However, we still don't understand what happens in 500. That intermingling comes to an absolute halt, and severe endogamy starts setting in at this point, which is the caste system. Effectively, what you're seeing is around 500 AD is the birth of your caste system.
So in Ian Morris' book, Why the West Rules for Now, he has set up a very good system of grading the civilizations, in which he gives, he has given a point system. So if this particular proof of infrastructure was found, then these many points, like that. And what he also mentions is that if the civilization cannot break that threshold, there is, at each population level, he's grouping it according to population level. So at each population threshold, if it cannot surpass that threshold using development, then it goes into a very bad tailspin. It goes into a rapid decline. Was that what happened, or was that the genesis or the root cause of the caste system rigidization in India?
We think so. We're not sure about it, because the caveat that both Yuval Harari and Ian Morris put very early on in their books, if you read the fine print, is there's simply not enough data coming out of India at this point of time. They don't know what the markers are. There's not enough anecdotal evidence. There's not enough archaeological evidence. There's virtually nothing to go on at this point. So we assume that that is what is happening. But remember, this is also at a time where there is a significant climate change event, which is presumably, 536 AD is when there was a great eastern volcanic eruption and the whole year was dark. So 536 is one of those very clear marking points where something very major happens, where you see, a Maya collapse, you see collapses of the early Maya collapse. You see civilization collapses happening in Latin America. It wasn't Latin America, Central America. You see civilization collapses happening in Europe. You see civilization collapses happening in China. You see civilization collapses happening in India. In Europe, it is very clearly textually evidenced. Because you have the records of Justinian, so there's the plague of Justinian and things like that, and there is a lot of description of these astronomical events where the sun wasn't shining and things like that for a year, 2 years, and things like that. In China, you have that. In India, you have no record of it. For a country that is so proud about its astronomical and mathematical heritage, our ability to store these things is non-existent. So we still don't know. We suspect that was happening, but remember, this was also a point of time when a lot of people were migrating. Remember, the Huns and things like that were invading Europe at this point. There was significant push on the Germanic tribes from the further proto-Mongol, proto-Turkic. We really don't know what they are, but people pushing west at this point of time, and the same thing is happening in India as well. You have the Hunas coming in, you have the Shakas, you have the Kushans also, in a sense, coming in at this point, though the Kushan invasions weren't all that disruptive. So there's population migrations happening. There is some kind of economic collapse happening, and I suspect that is tied. It wasn't just a natural collapse. It was a collapse. It was a natural collapse precipitated by climate change and population migration.
Shall I continue? So there was a brief mention of Turkish invasion in your explanation of the hypothesis. So do you agree with the fact that the knowledge that we compiled during the period that we are talking about right now in India, it got destroyed by the Turkish or Islamic invasions, and how much of impact or damage it has created to the civilizational progress overall?
No, I answered this question. There basically wasn't, in India, you didn't have practical literacy. You had clerical literacy, you had elite literacy. Okay, practical record keeping, storing was non-existent at this point. Archiving has always been a problem in India. I mean, forget at that point of time. Even today, if you want to get something out of the National Archives has lost almost 70% of what they store. And even now, if you want something from the archives, you have to wait for 5 days in an age of computerization. You have to wait for 5 days just to get the books that you want, maybe more. Sometimes some of my research assistants have gone and they've had to wait for 2 months for a book that they wanted to be given. So if your archiving is so bad now, imagine how bad it was then, right? So there's been a lot of issues because Europe, like I said, I mentioned this very specifically. European wars were extremely barbarous, destructive, and brutal. And yet a lot has survived. So in India, we can't get away with this thing saying that it was all destroyed. This is like that famous joke of the global telecom conference happening, and there is Italian, a Swedish archaeologist and an Indian archaeologist happening. And what happens is that, the Roman archaeologist says, we had ways of communicating with each other because we found this box where the flame, it could be moderated. So we had some early version of Morse code. The Swedish guy says, see, we have Ericsson, we have Nokia and all of that in Sweden. It isn't new. Well, Finland, Finno-Sweden, Scandinavia. It isn't new because we found these copper wires going from one city to another city. So we postulate there might have been communication, wired communication, telephones of some kind at that point of time, 1,000 years back. The Indian says, just this. You're talking about Morse code and wire communication. We had wireless communication 5,000 years back. How did you have wireless communication? Because we never found any wires. So, this kind of logic doesn't work. This standard Indian thing is, we had it. We had planes. Why? Because the Mahabharata mentions we had Pushpaka Vimana, Ramayana. Therefore, we had planes. बस ये चलता नहीं है.
So I wanted to ask you that, do you think that the geography has played a detrimental role in socio-cultural unification of India as a single political entity throughout our history?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes, the Indian geography, do you think that the Indian geography has played detrimental role in the socio-cultural unification of India as a single political entity throughout our history?
How? Because we've always been very culturally united for the longest part of history. The Harappan civilization was almost 10 times the size of Egypt. If you look at the spread of it, it was almost 3-4 times the size of Mesopotamia and 10 times the size of Egypt. You look at that cultural continuum that existed in India, be it in terms of the pre-Islamic Indian civilization or the post-Islamic Turkic Persianate Turkic thing, it was almost standardized across India. So no, it's never actually played that role at all. And you have to ask the question, sorry, just getting back to the last question, to Chinmay's question. See, how is it that when the Turks invaded Persia and the Mongols destroyed Persia so systematically that its population took 700 years to get back? Persia's population reached its pre-1250 levels only in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So that is how systematically the Mongols destroyed Persia. How is it that they have all these records still intact? A lot lost. It's probably only 5 to 10% available of what was there, but they still have all of it. They have all their architecture intact. You can still go to Persepolis. You can still go outside Baghdad to the old Sassanid capital of Tisfun and see their great architecture. Why can't you see it here? So, again, even if you say the Turks were particularly barbarous in India, the Turks couldn't have been more barbarous in India than the Mongols were in Persia. So the case is not made. But going back to geography, no. In fact, India's geography being separated from the rest of the world by the Hindu Kush Himalaya continuum and the relatively low height of the Vindhyas, it's actually ensured a certain kind of unity, cultural unity.
Right. Another question I wanted to ask was that, do you find any biggest flaw in our civilization during the period of, let's say, 300 AD to 600 AD, which eventually started a steep decline of our civilization?
Yes, religion. There's too much. I guess this is the point where karma sharma comes in. And you're more interested in the esoteric than you are in the practical. Har cheez karma. If you're suffering in this life, don't worry, your next life will be much better. Okay, that division between theology and philosophy that happened in the West, because they didn't have a concept of reincarnation. In the Roman and Greek religion, when you died, you went to a place called Hades, where everything was gray and it was the underworld. So they didn't have a concept of karma. In Egypt, you were reborn. It was very much like the Christian concept of rebirth in a heaven with the gods and things like that. It wasn't cyclic karma like you have in Eastern philosophy. What that means is India became too obsessed when you faced a difficulty in this life. You didn't want to solve the problem. You immediately said, इस life में ठीक नहीं होगा, अगले life में कर लेंगे. So there is that extrapolation, that esoteric explanation for everything, which removes the practicality and the practical viability of your thought processes and your civilization. This is the reason that when the Turks come in, they consider Indian philosophy, and for most of history, even today, I will openly come out and say it, Indian philosophy is far, far, far inferior to Western philosophy in terms of its practical application to your life. If you think somehow that your business decisions can be solved by chanting Om and doing meditation, congratulations to you, I don't.
My question is rather not totally in line with the discussion, but some futuristic input from your side. Considering the technological advancements and the new ideas of globalization, individualism, and all these things, do you think it has some impact on the pace of civilization that we might experience? And in the Indian context, how will you elaborate these things that it will have an impact on the space, the speed of the thing?
So, it's always best to take a middle of the path approach. Too much individualism is also bad. Too much socialism is also very bad. I think in India, there was way too much individualism for a collective conscience to develop. Way too much individualism for a sense of public duty and public goods to develop. And remember, all historical progress is multi-causal. Like I showed you with my monologue at the beginning, it wasn't just one thing. It was wealth transfusion from the sack of Constantinople. It was the Black Death. We might have never had the Renaissance without the Black Death. We may have, but we may not have. So it was a lot of things happening at the same point of time. So the stimulus that Europe got, both of natural causes, but external stimulus completely outside their own control, did not happen in India. And therein lies the problem. All things have to happen simultaneously to produce certain results. The stimuli were different. So it's not a question of individualism per se. With the benefit of hindsight, we can say there was too much individualism. Today, there's too much socialism. So it's finding the mean. But even if you found the mean, the external stimulus, like having a devastating plague, or having, a sort of sudden bonus infusion of wealth, needs to happen. Because, when you ask a socialist today, a modern example, give me an example of where socialism has not failed. The only example they'll give you is Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Scandinavia, essentially. Scandinavia plus Finland. And that's complete bullshit. And I'll tell you why. Because that model, each one of those 4 countries has a very specific external. They were all on the brink of bankruptcy and extreme poverty when there was one very specific fluke event that happened that was not in their own control that gave them a certain fillip. Now, in case of Denmark, it was an extremely poor agricultural country. And it was agriculture that came to their rescue, because in both in World War I and World War II, what happens is it's the pork supply to Allied and Axis troops that actually sees an increase. The Dutch economy during World War II actually grew, surprise, surprise, because of war demand. So, war is actually a great generator of, it's called a war economy for a reason, because it's a generator of wealth in a sense. Somebody else's misery is your gain. So Denmark grew because of the need for agricultural products during the war. Sweden benefited very specifically. Sweden was on the brink of economic collapse just before World War I and then again before World War II. And what came to their help was bloated steel prices. They made all their money selling steel and armaments to the Germans and to the both to the Axis and the Allies. In case of Norway, Norway was considered a third world, sorry to use the word, but shithole, to use Trump's famous words, by the Swedes. The Swedes were actually waiting for Norwegian independence. You know, when Norway declared, do you know how many people died in the Norwegian War of Independence? 24. Of them, only one was killed deliberately. Okay, the rest were rioters. Basically, either they were too drunk on beer or whatever that they smashed their own bottles on their heads and died and things like that. 24 people. This is a so-called War of Independence. The Swedes were glad to be rid of Norway. They're like, your uncivilized country bumpkins, please go away. We don't want you. Good riddance to bad rubbish. And they were poor. They were actually costing the Swedish economy money. And then what happens is they discover North Sea oil reserves and they grow rich. Essentially, Norway is a white Saudi Arabia. But they invested in human beings. They spent the money wisely. Now Saudi Arabia is doing the Dubai UAE model and they're investing in human beings. So it's going to be more sustainable. Finland. Again, Finland was dirt poor. What happens in Finland is that you become a sort of staging point for a lot of the Western interventions into Russia after the revolution, number one. That creates some kind of this thing. You benefit from trade that you're doing with Sweden. But the biggest thing that makes Finland rich is something called the Finnish shipping cluster. It was one of many clusters, but the Finnish shipping cluster is the most notable because Finland used to provide the USSR and the entire Eastern Bloc with Western quality technology, which the USSR desperately wanted. And that literally transforms Finland into becoming a very rich country because you've got a monopoly position. No other Western country wants to sell to the USSR, but Finland will. And Finland has access to Western technology because they're integrated in with Germany and Sweden and things like that. So each one had a great fluke that made them rich. So everything is multi-causal, it is intersectional, and it is sometimes a sheer fluke event can lead to certain things. For example, the Black Death in India wouldn't have led to anything because you'd still have an excess population. In Europe, it was very significant. So it's event plus overlaid on local conditions.
Again, related to May's question, but it's more nuanced. As in, India falls in the, let's say, good sunlight belt. Just pretty much closer to the equator, but not so close as to have, I mean, at least the northern part is not so close as to have deadly epidemic diseases like Africa does, or say Central America, I mean, Central South America does. So is this the reason that combined with that our agricultural arable land percentage, which has always been so high historically for thousands and thousands of years?
No, it doesn't. Actually, there are different kinds of diseases. Remember, the bubonic plague isn't a tropical disease at all. The bubonic plague is actually a Siberian tundra disease. It comes from northern Mongolia, eastern Siberia. That's where it originates. So diseases don't have to be tropical. Quite the contrary. In fact, India, it is its natural resilience to a whole load of tropical diseases. You know, Bengal, for example, one of the reasons, Bengal civilized very, very late. Bengal becomes civilized only under the Mughals and under the late Turkic reign. Because at that point, it is such dense forest, you had almost 25% fatality year on year, year after year because of malarial swarms. When the British first come to Calcutta, they used to dread going to Calcutta because of the high fatality rates. Most of the British officers stationed in Calcutta used to die of malaria because they had no way of combating it. The locals at least had some kind of natural immunity, which is why, remember, vaccination also starts off in India, primitive vaccination. Right? Why? It was specifically for that kind of disease. Arable land is completely different because when you have so many rivers, remember in Iraq, you only have 2 rivers. That's why Mesopotamia, Potami in Greek is river, Meso between 2 rivers. So Mesopotamia, Egypt is just 1 river. So the vulnerability to change was extremely great in those regions. In India, you have so many rivers, 7 rivers in the north, 5, 6 rivers in the south. It was obvious that your arable land was going to be more and therefore your population was going to be a lot more. It has nothing realistically to do with disease.
uh, what I wanted to ask is it that the comfort provided due to a certain amount of reliability of an arable land never raised the demand for say aggressive expansions or militarily strong technology or something like that?
I won't say that, because you look at the very first mention of a catapult is in India. It happens in the Mahajanapada period. This is something that you'll find in Romila Thapar, and it is called a Mahashila Kantaka. So sometime around 700 BC, when nobody else had catapults, you had something called a Mahashila Kantaka, which was very clearly an early catapult from the description. The first horse stirrups, very basic, it was just a rope where you put your toe to stabilize yourself, was discovered in India. India was an extremely violent place. Never go by this theory. There was constant internal war. The problem was, why is it that most European kings focused? Why did the Romans focus on colonizing only the Mediterranean? Because it was geographically viable for them, because they had fleets of ships. As opposed to, say, going north of the Danube and things like that, when they won defeat, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 14 BC, I think it is, under Augustus, and that stops the northern expansion. Right, so no, it was actually an extremely violent place. You did, in fact, have a lot of significant military innovation happening. Wood steel, the steel from which the pillar of the Gupta pillar in the Qutub Minar is made, was one of those inventions. So no, there was a period of military innovation happening at that point of time. It did not, it wasn't the comfort provided at all. You actually find that the sort of warlikeness, that extremely aggressive tendencies, which were nurtured incidentally by things like the Ashwamedha. The Ashwamedha Yajna was what? It's the ritual of a sedentary tribe to maintain its military skills, that every year you let a horse loose, and where it goes, you have to go fight. It was ritualized warfare. You had to fight, right? It was a duty to fight and to expand your territory. Otherwise, why would the Guptas expand? Why would Harsha expand? Why would Harsha and the Chalukyas keep fighting the way they were? Why did the Pallavas expand? Why did the Cholas expand, etc., etc., etc.? No, it was extremely violent. And there was significant military. So you read about the Chora shipping expedition, which is the first long-range power projection in history. Remember, the Indian fleet, the Chora fleet, it went all the way from the Tamil Nadu coast to Indonesia. That's about 3,000-4,000 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken. Compared to this, Julius Caesar, when he invaded Britain, only went, what, 40 kilometers? What's the width of the English Channel? 40 kilometers.
40 kilometers. Yes.
Right. So even that wasn't a very big deal. When they invade Egypt, for example, you're only coming from northern Greece to Alexandria, which is about a few hundred kilometers at best. So military technology, not at all. What happens is there is a difference that caste leads to this whole thing of horses somehow being superior, and you have this sort of, what's the correct word for it? This lust after things you can't produce or can't have as being a higher social status weapon. It's not very different from, say, the Mahabharata and things where foot soldiers used to fight on foot, but the kings and things had to fight on chariot. Right. Very similar thing happens in here, but then your love for horses becomes so overweening, you're so enamored by horses that your military skills go. Now, there were large parts of India where those military skills never went. Remember, the Assamese and the Odiyas, they held out for a very, very long time against the Turks. Odisha wasn't destroyed by the Turks. Odisha was first destroyed by constant warfare with Vijayanagar. Vijayanagar destroyed Odisha, and then the Turks came and invaded Odisha. So that martial instinct was there for a very long time, till you start losing so many battles. You take this very pacifist approach, saying, okay, I may be under Turkish rule today, but in my next life, I will not be under Turkish rule.
I wanted to ask, continuing on that, as you rightly put, that constant internal wars maybe kept us from patronizing the research and technology, because the uh, kings were more used to, and rather they indulged in reaching their political stability rather than looking out for new science and technology. Do you think that could be one of the reasons as to we don't have
Sorry, can you just
many
repeat that very,
innovations
very slowly?
even after doing so?
Can you just repeat that very slowly? Sorry, it was too fast.
Yes. Yes. So constant wars caused all these kings to fight for their political stability. As a result, we see them, investing in arms and military capabilities, but not in science and technology. So, do you think this is one of the reasons as to why we weren't able to find any new innovations even after 700 AD?
Not really. Sometimes, war is actually a very good thing for innovation. War is the mother of all innovation. You look at Europe, there is a reason that Europe managed to, devastate the Middle East and conquer a large parts of it during the First Crusade. So, war actually keeps your military much, much more fine-tuned, and it spurs innovation. So they clearly were investing in science and technology because you always wanted better weapons, with which you want that sort of the silver bullet, the proverbial silver bullet to defeat your enemy. Right. So that wasn't the issue at all. Quite different, in fact. What you see is it's more that there is no concept of a public good. There is no investment in your people. And mind you, this actually continues even into the Muslim period in India. You go to Persia and to Turkey. Every 50, 60 kilometers, you will see the Safavids and the Ottomans. They build caravanserais, they build wells, they build all kinds of things for their people, public bathhouses. So you can stay clean, you can live in a caravanserai because trade is good, free of cost. You will be provided meals for up to 3 days, and your horses will be fed. And you can get new horses out there if you want. You have none of that here. Right? So it's actually a very different thing. The wars made you stronger in a way because they keep you up to date in terms of military technology. But we never had a concept of who we are and who the other is. So, the same date, the same year, I think it was 1094, I forget when. But it's the same year that Rajendra Chola launches his expedition to Indonesia, that Mahmud Ghazni comes and sacks Somnath. Now, Rajendra Chola is a great Shiva Bhakta. One of the Jyotirlingas has been smashed. What is his reaction to it? Kuch nahi. I don't care. Did you ever see a unified Hindu response to the Turks? The Turks had an idea, we are Muslims, we are Turks, you are not. But did the Hindus ever have that idea that we are Hindus, we are going to unite against you? No. Did the Christians even have that reaction? They did. That is what the Crusades were about. You had French, Germans, Italians, Austrians, Spanish, Brits all coming together to free the Holy Land. Why didn't you have your own? This is around about the same time. Why didn't you have that reaction? So what Huntington says, this salience and substance, it didn't exist. Salience is what connects us. Substance is what divides us. We never had it.
Throughout history, we can see that, Abrahamic religions, as a fact, are a new phenomenon in human evolution, let's say. You talked about salience, and they do introduce salience in a very solid manner, in an institutionalized manner. And before pre-Abrahamic religions, if we look at, say, the Huns, Kushans, and the Shakas, now two popular historic facts are there. One is that the Shaka Samvatsar, that is the Shak calendar that we follow, So the starting year of that is the year when the King Vikramaditya defeated the Shakas, and they had come in up to Sindh, modern day Sindh. The second one is the story of King Samudragupta in the Gupta period, and he defeated the Hunas, and it is said that he had taken an oath that he would not play his veena. So his coins are all found with him, depicting him as a musician, and he won't play the veena till he has defeated the external enemies. That is what he took an oath. So if we could see this kind of, what you talked about, subject and salience, that they are clearly talking about external invaders and defeating them, and they did defeat them. I mean, Attila the Hun went into Rome, sacked it, and went back, and all of these barbarians, they caused in one manner or the other a decline of the Roman Empire. A decline of the non-Christian Roman Empire. But in India, we see that we had defeated all the previous non-religious, quote unquote, invaders, but we could not do it when religion comes in. So, first of all, is that a correct observation? And
yes and no.
then why?
Yes and no. I'll tell you why. The decline of Rome wasn't caused by the barbarians. Why did the barbarians invade Rome? Because Rome overexpanded and it had too many borders with too many barbarians. So, Rome was a classic case of overexpansion. It happens to every empire. With the Hunas and the Shakas, remember, the Hunas and Shakas were the Huna atrocity stories are Buddhist stories. They're not Hindu stories. Toramana and Mirakula were great Shiva Bhaktas. Right? They were culturally part of your own continuum. Oh. We see it. Remember, we adopted the Shaka calendar because we wanted something that was closest to the Western calendar. So this was off the Western calendar by 70 years or so, 70, 80 years. I forget what the exact number is, but it was closest to the Western calendar and we wanted an Indian calendar. That's why we adopted it. But the year of the Shakas being defeated is no great historical memory in India. The year of the Hunas being defeated is very much a Buddhist historical memory. It isn't Hindu historical memory. In fact, one of the reasons that the Shungas are considered so badly is because of the Buddhist historical memory that they were a violent reaction to Buddhist conversion. The Hunas again were Shiva Bhaktas. So all the atrocity literature you see about them is Buddhist atrocity literature. So there was no concept of these people being foreign. You never saw anybody coming from outside as foreign. They saw you as foreign. Okay. Now, you also see this to a certain extent in Rome, but it was a cultural thing. One of the reasons is that by the end of the Roman Empire, the Germans had been completely Romanized. Alaric, who sacks Rome in 410 AD, he was the head of he was the field marshal of the Roman army at one point of time. He was the Magister Militum. So that's like saying tomorrow if Sam Manekshaw ordered the Air Force to bomb Delhi in some military coup after 1971, it's like claiming it was the Persian invasion of Delhi by a Parsi fellow. It's that ridiculous. Alaric himself was a Christian. That's the amazing thing. Now, the Roman thing was that there are two Romes. There is a Greek Rome and there is a Latin Rome. They did not want to accept that there is a Northern German Rome. So it was very much an identity thing because they did not see the Germans as being elite, as having contributed civilization to them. So in India, you had this concept of Mleccha. You cross the 7 seas, we won't touch you. If you come from abroad, we won't touch you and things like that. But that, again, was a concept of you're not equal to us. You're inferior to us. That doesn't mean you're a threat. It's very different. Think of it this way. You will let your maid into your house. But if a guy just walks out from a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW outside your house, you won't let him inside your house without first asking him stuff. right? In this case, they saw the Turks, or as we call them, the Turushkas, as somehow barbarians. पर ठीक है, घर पोछने आए हैं, साफ करने, झाड़ू पोछा लगाने आए हैं, ठीक है. Don't confuse. They saw you as enemies. The Jhadu Pocha Wali wants to kill you. She wants to kill you, torture you, get the combination to the safe and take out all the jewels and your money in there. But for you, she is just Jhadu Pocha Wali who's come to clean my house. That was the difference. So substance and salience, again, identity is a very complex issue that, it's not so direct.
Concluding message, Abhijit. I mean, we had this session based on a constant question that has been pestering us as to if we had individual brilliance, which we always had. I mean, even in the invasions era, we did have some sparks of why did it not grow into a institutionalized a process? So what would be the kind of change that we should do to our mindsets? Whether we need to change our whole Hindu philosophy for that, and what would you, in short, what would you like for the Indic mindset to change?
Look, the Indic mindset is too ossified right now. It's a celebration of third-ratedness. When you can't explain things to a Western audience, you claim the Western audience doesn't understand you because you're talking from an Indic paradigm. That's not the way it works. That's like Ford coming here, not making cars that India wants to buy and then saying problem market mein hai, mere marketing strategy. Okay. So you can't be a Ford, you have to be a Hyundai. Unfortunately, with the low levels of humanities knowledge we have in this country, and just generally the non-existent investment on education, you are not going to go anywhere. And the Indic mindset is fundamentally a defeatist mindset. It is constantly focusing on fixing the past. It's not looking to the future. The Indic mindset should be wealth creation. But it turns out that the one so-called savior of Indics, Narendra Modi, is more to the left of Sitaram Yechuri than Karl Marx was. So till then, and remember, don't get too dogmatic about being right, because at some point you have to introduce some levels of socialism. Otherwise, it'll be catastrophic. The wise man picks and chooses. Dogma is a mental cage. Never dogmatize. Pick and choose carefully. Different solutions. Why would you, if somebody is giving you a whole range of solutions, why would you want to reduce the number of solutions? Right now, the Indic mind is an extremely low-level mindset. It is obsolete. It asks all the wrong questions. It wants answers that make it happy, not answers that it needs to listen to. And that is the fundamental ossification of the mind. That inquisitiveness that led to Aryabhatta and the Vedas and Advaita and Charvaka and all of that is just finished. A shadow of our former self. You want to improve, first start investing in human beings. To invest in human beings, you have to start growing the economy. Okay, not slogans like Sabka Saath, Sabka Bakwas or Atmanirbhar Bharat. Not slogans, actions.
So thank you, Abhijit, for coming in, and we definitely like to have you on more.
Thank you so much for your time, and get well soon. We want you to